everybody, I'm Maureen. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be sharing with you my pattern review for ME Pattern 2001, which is the Beauty J'adore coat, which you guys know I've been trying to make since last year, which is also at the top of my Make 9 list. Alright, so let's just jump into this pattern. So this is the pattern we know and love. This is the envelope, of course. Nikki actually did, I guess you could call it a Kelly green. Mine is a hunter green. And so let's talk about fabric suggestions. So tweed, wool blends, gabardine, cotton blends, and then for the lining, polyester lining fabric, and then of course interfacing. And then the sizing on this is pretty generous. I did a 24 wide, which gave me a bust of 46, hip of 48, waist of 39. So I basically gave myself like 2 inches of ease at every point. 2 inches of ease at my bust, 2 inches of ease at the waist, and then at the hips. So this pattern takes about 5 to 6 yards of outer lining fabric, and then around 3.5 to 4 yards of lining fabric. So some other things that I want to share with you that are kind of like the feature of this pattern. It does come with the wide lapels, obviously the tabs on the cuff, the carriers with the belt loops, or the carriers with the belt. And then of course, like I said, it is lined. The lining at the bottom of this jacket or this coat is open, it's unattached. So that was new for me. And then of course, this does come with the side pockets. So overall, the construction took about 7 days for me, from the time I cut the pattern to cutting the fabric to working on it. And in those 7 days, I worked on it anywhere between 30 minutes to maybe 2 hours a day. And I want to say the hardest part about the construction was when I got to the lining. Otherwise, it was your traditional coat pattern. So for the most part, I did follow the instructions to the T. There were some modifications that I made off the top for myself. So one of the first modifications I did, which was I actually shortened this pattern by 2 inches with the lengthen and shorten line on the pattern pieces. And then I also, once I actually cut my wool fabric, because I did use wool for this, I stay stitched the bottom hems, because wool, believe it or not, actually has the tendency to grow when you are working on it, especially when you're working on a coat this length. Believe me, I know from experience, your wool can grow. The other thing I did with the hemlines of the wool was that I actually did a 2-inch thick or 2-inch wide interfacing at the bottom of each of the panels. So at the bottom of my front panels, I put a 2-inch wide interfacing. In the bottom of the back panels, I put a 2-inch wide interfacing. And that was to just kind of stabilize the hem, since I knew after looking at the instructions and analyzing what other people had done, I knew that the lining was going to be unattached. So I wanted there to be a more stable hem. So, and that's why I added the interfacing. So I highly recommend, even though it's not in the instructions, I do recommend that you do add interfacing to the hemline of that, and possibly stay stitch it as well. So the other things that I did was I also did the flat sleeve method for putting the sleeve in. I know that per the instructions, they wanted me to kind of ease it in, but to be honest with you, given how this fabric was, the weight of the fabric and everything, I felt pretty confident going into the flat sleeve method. I was able to achieve it, accomplish it, no big issues at all. The other major thing, you guys, let me go grab it. If you do not have a clapper and you are working on wool or any sort of project of this magnitude, and you know that the fabric can be bulky or thick, get one of these. It's literally called a clapper. I got this off Amazon. I'll link it below, but it's like a wooden block, I guess you could call it. But what it does is, after you have pressed your seams, after you have done your seams, you go to your iron and you press them. As soon as you press them with steam now, you lay it on top of that seam and you just press it gently for a couple of seconds. You'll notice that when you do this, it's going to trap the heat. And when it does that, it makes the seam lay flatter. And so when I tell you that this clapper was my best friend during this entire project, it truly was, especially for the lining part, especially for the bulky seams. This thing was my baby. Highly recommend. So speaking of the lining and whatnot, I will say that when it came to connecting the outer piece and the lining piece, I did trim, or actually, no. I take that back. The directions called for me to trim the seam allowance. I actually graded the seam allowance. So if you're not familiar with the purpose of grading your seams is like, say you have 2 seams, right? Honestly, I realized like my hand demonstration was probably not going to work out. So, okay, I have 2 examples here. Basically, I just pretty much did a straight stitch on both of these, right? Let me show you what happens if you just trim a seam allowance. I trim this down to a 1/4 inch. And what happens is the seam becomes bulkier. So when you fold it onto itself, it's bulky, and it's bulkiest at that seam that we just did. However, if I grade my seam, meaning that I keep one side of my seam regular, and then I keep the other one, or if I snip the other one, right, down. What happens is that when I fold it on itself, it's easier to do a top stitch. It's easier to press that down. It literally just makes it an easier seam to manipulate. And you'll notice too that when you do just a blunt trim and you trim them equally, it is so much harder to press it, to manipulate, to top stitch and everything. I'm even having a hard time holding these pieces together. But with this, I'm just gently holding these pieces together. And if I was to press this together, it would lay much flatter. So I graded all of my seams just like you see here when it came to attaching the lining. And I feel like it worked out well because my lapels weren't bulky. Like nothing was really bulky on this pattern for me because not only did I have my clapper, but I also graded my seams. And that's just a little tip, like if you're working with really bulky fabric or something like that. And that's kind of what I did. So you guys know that I do not like hand sewing, and I did quite a bit of hand sewing on this. Not only did I hand sew the bottom hem, which the code is like right here beside me, so I'll just show you guys. I hand sewed the bottom hem, you guys. And also, by the way, this coat, I think because it's wool and also it's so close to the ground and just everything about it, it catches a lot of things. There is like just dust bunnies galore everywhere. But I hand sewed that, and you can even see where I did my trim there, or not my trim. You can even see where I did my stay stitch. You can see some of that interfacing, but it's also covered up by the open bottom hem. The other thing that I hand stitched, you guys, oh y'all, so can we talk about these tabs? I love these tabs, but let me just pull this closer. I love these tabs, but my machine was like, girl, what are you doing? So the tabs got really thick in this part right here, and my machine was like, I don't care if you use the hand wheel, I'm not going over this area. Like my machine was indignant. So I actually had to like stop stitching like right about here, and I had to hand sew about 1 inch of the sleeve on both sides. So yeah, that was something different. But I don't feel like that ruined the construction or that like ruined the integrity of anything. It was just that my machine just can't handle that bulk. And I would say most domestic machines probably can't handle that level of bulk. So if you find yourself hand sewing this part, you're not alone. I also hand sewed the closing of this belt as well. And I think that's pretty much it as far as the hand sewing. The other thing I did during the construction process and with all of my markings, I actually used chalk. I did not trust that using a marker would like go that it would go away or anything like that. So I used some white chalk and it worked out really well. And yeah. So there's a couple of things that if I were to make this again, I would absolutely change. And it's really not a lot, but it actually would make a difference in a lot of things. So I would say that the number one thing I would change if I were to do this again is I would add the carriers and the pocket bags to each of the front pieces and the back pieces before I would connect them at the shoulders. With 5 yards of fabric, it was very hard to carry the body of the coat from my cutting table to just like 3 feet over to my sewing machine to 6 feet over to my iron. It was a lot of like, I feel like a lot of work, and I was kind of, I don't want to say I was overheating, but I was like, this could have been a little bit more efficient if I had just did the carriers and the pockets first. And speaking of the carriers, I'm going to put up a quick reel that shows how I actually attach the carriers, because there was no way that I was going to be able to top stitch these carriers in. So I'm going to bring this closer now. Let me see if I can find it on here. So I made these slits in the body of the coat that were just wide enough for the carriers. And I slid the carriers into those slits, and then I pretty much, kind of like how you would do a welt pocket, I pretty much stitched that piece of fabric closed, making sure that it caught the carrier as well. And that was something that I got from Mimi G when she was working on her version of this coat, and I thought it was a great idea because, like I said, there was just no way I was going to be able to top stitch those carriers, especially since I had such a hard time with the tabs. So I highly recommend, definitely if you're working with wool for this specific jacket or this specific coat, definitely use the method that I used and Mimi G used. And I literally used my buttonhole cutter because it's the same width as the carrier. I think if I were to do this again, I don't know if I would do wool again. The wool, like I said, was a challenge with just the weight of it. But honestly, personally, I don't think I need 2 wool coats like this. I think if I had a wool coat that was like this and then possibly a lighter like trench style raincoat, which reminds me Nikki just launched, like she just dropped her Know Me design that is a trench coat that has very similar lapels. But honestly, I've seen people do this specific coat. I've seen it by Holly Dolly Darling and a couple of other people. They did quilted fabric, which hats off to them, because I don't know about doing quilted fabric with this. Otherwise, I thought this coat was great. I keep looking at it because it's, like I said, it's off camera, but I love this coat. If you know anything about the story of this coat, it's been a long time coming, and I wanted to make it in October. I wanted to make it in November. I was like, I'll do it in December, and here we are in January, and it's the second thing that I made. If you're interested in knowing more about my fabric, I did get this fabric from Fine Fabrics, and when I did my Fine Fabrics haul on this channel, I actually walk you through some of the process of finding this fabric there. And if you know the story about this coat was not supposed to be green. It was honestly supposed to be a dark charcoal. And now that I've made this coat, I'm really glad that it didn't end up being a dark charcoal. I'm really glad that it is a nice neutral olive green coat. And so I say all that to say that everything works out in the end. So yeah. Anyway, you guys, thank you so much for watching this video. Now, if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like and subscribe button. And if you have any questions for me down below on this pattern or how I did the lining or just any questions about wool in general, go ahead and put those down below as well. And if you're not following me already, you can follow me at Raven Maureen on Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. See you guys next time. Bye.